if they had come straight from the battlefield. The physical condition they were in was very shocking, but they would be x-rayed, and if the shrapnel or bullets were seen, then we had to have an emergency in the theatre there. There might be an amputation that had to be done because the wound itself was so bad and it was all going gangrene and it was affecting the rest of the arm, leg, and so it had to be amputated.
You were called the dirty nurse, and you had to do all the mucky things. And they just amputated the leg, and they put it in a bucket. And I had to take the wretched leg away in a bucket down to the incinerator. I didn't like it. You've no idea what a leg weighs when it's once amputated.
This young fella, I suppose he was perhaps taller than I was, but he did want his mummy so much. He cried for his mummy. Oh, I said, I'll be your mummy tonight. And I gave him a hug. And he went to sleep quite quietly.
The soldiers who advanced into no man's land were fighting the first war of the modern industrial age. Shrapnel and machine gun fire mowed down wave after wave of troops, their bodies torn apart by a relentless hail of metal. Over 2 million soldiers from Britain and her empire were wounded. More than 1 million died. Yet this tragedy provided the impetus for one of the most humane stories of the Great War, nursing the injured back to health.
My brother had been through the Dardanelles, came back to Gaza and was killed by the Turks in 1917. And that was a fearful blow to me. I was in training in the hospital, and I think it did rather alter my feeling to these men, that you felt that you wanted to do anything you could to get them well and to make them happy.
I was at home and led a very gay life. And my sister, who's older, said to me, "How can you live like that when our men are being killed and there's a war on? You ought to join up and do some war work." And that set my conscience ticking. So I joined up, and the story continues as a VAD.
Leslie Lee Jones was one of tens of thousands of women who enrolled as a VAD, or Voluntary Aid Detachment, to assist the professional nurses. As the VADs, organised by the Red Cross and the Order of St. John, were unpaid, most were recruited from middle and upper class families. The minimum age to join was 19, but many younger girls tricked their way in.
I had to go up to Devonshire House to see the head of the Red Cross. He interviewed me over a double desk, and I was always very good at reading on the other side when I was sitting there. And he said, "How old are you?" So I said, 20, sir. So he said, "How old?" And I could see him now looking over the top of his glasses. I said, 20, sir. I saw him write down, age 20, apparent age 16. I said, "Now you've written it down, sir, in black and white, you can't alter it. But it isn't 16, it's 17. And he did a grin and left it as it was and passed me.
VADs like Marjorie Grigsby, the daughter of a hotelier, were posted to military wards all over Britain. With a mass of war-wounded soldiers needing urgent treatment, British hospitals became so overstretched that the nurses, assisted by the VADs, took over the running of many military wards. Phyllis Dry was a general nurse working at Clacton Hospital in 1914.
We had to do far more because the doctors were there only half a week each, and often there was no doctor there at all. So you had dressings and treatment to do. You were there, you were a female crowd. There was matron, sister, and the nurses, and VADs. And you had everything to do. By 9 o'clock, everything had to be done. The ward had to be swept on both sides, the lockers cleaned, because each patient had a locker, and the casters of the beds had to be level. You couldn't have a caster out like anything like that. It had to be absolutely level and all these things had to be done, and the ward had to be clean, fresh and ready for anything by 9 o'clock.
From the beginning of the war, the casualty rates were shockingly high. In the first few months alone, 100,000 men were transported home from France to hospitals all over Britain. The sheer volume of injured soldiers meant that many military wards were also set up in rapidly converted convalescent homes, manor houses and church halls. The men arrived at each hospital in convoys of around 100, often with appalling, untreated wounds. Their suffering presented an unprecedented challenge for the general nurses and even more for the VADs, who only had a basic training in first aid. 16-year-old VAD Doris Neve worked in a makeshift hospital on Cheltenham Racecourse.
I just did what I was told, and there wasn't any time at all before the convoys were arriving from France. And we were told that the first convoy was coming along, and I hadn't been there long at all, and not long enough to learn anything. And they were just brought in by the ambulance men and dumped as they were onto beds. And they were awful sights to look at, with all mud and filth and bad wounds. I remember one very young chap couldn't lie on his front at all. He got wounds all down his back. I was sorry for him, and he was only a boy, really.
The soldiers, well, a lot of them were dying. A lot of them were very badly wounded, of course, and moaning and screaming. But it was very important to get their name and religion after them, off this field badge which they came in. And I was standing by a soldier, and he took out of his pocket a lovely gold watch, and he simply said, "Give this to my son." And he died.
Oh, some was simply dreadfully smattered with blood and everything like that, and terribly, terribly tired. Some very distressed by gas, of course, which was so prevalent in those days over there. And altogether, when they were put to bed, those that had to be helped, were so grateful generally, not all by any manner of means, because they were angry that they'd gone through all they had gone through. We did our best.
I thought it was terrible, but I had to peel off these awful clothes. Days of dirt on them, it was caked on. And I just could hardly bear it at first. And when we tried to wash the wounds, put the sterilised dressing over them and a bandage, and that was it. You had to do, as the sister said, the best you could until she came and did a little bit extra to make them more comfortable or to dress their wounds better.
The contrast between the life and death struggles on the military wards and the middle-class homes many nurses had come from could not have been greater. In these circumstances, the nurses tried desperately to retain their composure.
Of course one felt like crying, because, I mean, you felt for these people. You had a heart, you had feelings. But it was no good going to pieces. You're not going to do anybody any good that way. You've got to control yourself before you can help anybody else. Men often would swear. You probably never heard some of the words ever before. And it was very coarse, which really rather shocked us, because we weren't used to this sort of thing. I had been brought up very strictly by my mother. But at the same time, you had to accept this, and you wouldn't dwell on it. You would try hard to get them to think of other things, and you didn't enjoy that sort of language. That, whatever they said could make no difference to your treatment to them.
The nurses had to learn to cope with the harsh realities of caring for severely wounded soldiers, but nothing could prepare them for the treatment of gangrene. Nora Clay was a general nurse at Leeds Convalescent Hospital.
The military wards had soldiers who had been very seriously wounded in the trenches, and they came in with terribly septic, deep, gangrenous wounds. And one of my vivid recollections when I was on the military ward was a man with a gaping wound about 14 inches long, right down to the bones of his lower leg, and I should think about 2 inches deep, and in the depth of that wound there was patches of gangrene, and they found that by introducing maggots into the wound, the maggots ate the gangrene, and then they could start to heal the leg up. But you can't heal a leg which has a wound in the depth covered with gangrene. You've got to get through the gangrene. That was a shock to me, to see, first of all, these nasty little things crawling about in the man's leg. They didn't come loose in the bed. It was exposed, you see, and they were having their feed. absolute hell. We were doing things we knew nothing about, giving injections to people with legs hanging out of trousers, heads half blown off, and using the same needle just dipped in carbolic 20, just one after another. We didn't really know what we were doing. All we were anxious to do was to put them out of their pain. Just try and give them a bit more dope of some sort to keep them quiet. Remember, they weren't coming in ones and twos. They were coming in 20s and 30s and 40s. There was no room for anybody else inside, so they were just put down on stretchers, pieces of fencing, pieces of wood, just put down and left, and off the stretcher bearers went to get some more. Oh, some of the men were calling for their mothers, some were calling for girlfriends or wives, or you didn't know who they wanted, they just called out. You knew the ones who wanted their mothers because they all said, oh, mum, mum. You know, like that. It was a nasty sight. I mean, you've got several thousands, remember that. There are too many to even pick out one individual from another. You just go on from one to the next. Another lot comes in, so you leave that one and go to another one. It's an absolute melee really of blood and thunder, and the guns going off too. So often, these very young men would look at you and say, you remind me of my mother, who would be 3 times my age.
Helen Gordon Dean worked as a VAD at casualty clearing stations on the Western Front when she was just 18. Despite her youth, men close to death looked to her for comfort and reassurance.
It's funny how quite strong men that you looked up to would be wanting to hold your hand during these moments. It was a very real expression of what I believe in very, very firmly, the physical contact with another life. It generally came from them. They wanted to hold your hand. And you wanted to hold theirs. It's a horrible feeling to know that somebody is going right into eternity at that moment.
Though the nurses made every effort to save the soldiers' lives, they were hampered by dreadful conditions and a lack of medical facilities. The seriously injured were urgently transferred from the casualty clearing stations to better equipped base hospitals further away from the front line. The journey involved convoys of ambulances operating a shuttle service through the war zone to link up with ambulance trains. Most were driven by women, who were in constant danger from artillery fire and sudden enemy advances.
When you drove along, when you saw anybody dying, if you've got room in your ambulance, you stopped and tried to get them in, even if you shoved them underneath the stretchers. Anywhere if you could get them in, if you thought there was the slightest chance of saving them, you tried to push them in. And there was only just one girl driver and one VAT to each ambulance. I suppose we'd gone about 4 or 5 miles. Bang! Oh my God. Tire gone. Had to stop the ambulance. All stretcher cases. Nobody could do anything to help you. Enemy guns firing nearer and nearer. It was dreadful. I really was frightened that time, because I didn't know. If you don't know what you're doing, you feel so hopeless, don't you? And somehow, I don't know how, we put another tire on and set off again.
There were over 60 military hospitals for British troops in Belgium and France, many of them organised at the main medical bases, such as Etaples, Rouen and Boulogne. Nurses and VADs worked at both base hospitals and casualty clearing stations. Their duties could include the strenuous task of carrying the soldiers on stretchers from the ambulance to their bed. Marjorie Grigsby was posted to Rouen in 1918.
I could lift one end of the stretcher. An ordinary average man of about 28 to 30 I could. Strangely enough, the head end was tighter than the legs end. I can lift that all right, but you got added strength and a lot of willpower. When they came in very cold and that, to get a warm drink, you couldn't give them any hot water bottles or anything of that sort. And there wasn't a lot of extra blankets or clothing.
Shortages of medical supplies would occur in the rapidly constructed hospitals when thousands of new casualties arrived after each major offensive. Often working in cold, dank conditions, nurses and VADs alike frantically cleaned and dressed the soldiers' wounds.
You had a faucet to hold a swab, and you had a dish with Lysol in it, and you had to quite brutally clean this nasty place up with the swab. And that was your job. It was all very primitive compared with what was at home. But I still loved it. To think that you're hopefully making somebody a bit more comfortable, a bit more well. That was lovely feeling.
The nurses not only had to deal with war wounds, but also with terrible epidemics of dysentery and flu. These diseases put at risk the lives of soldiers already weakened by their ordeal in the trenches. Alice McKinnon was a military nurse who served at the Etaples base hospital.
When flu came, flu was awful. But I never lost a patient with flu. But they certainly were ill. Well then, of course, during all this time, there'd be convoys either coming in or going out, and we never knew when they were coming or when they were going. But one boy I remember especially with flu. Oh, he'd been so ill. And this boy that I'd worked so hard with, he crying for his mummy, crying for his mummy. And the next night, they came for the convoy to take so many, and they just take them, nothing to do with me. I mean, they know who they are to take. And they had one place they hadn't filled, and they looked around, and they said they'd take that boy. Oh, I said, he's not strong enough. Give him 2 more days. He'd be all right. Well, no, the convoy had to go full. So he went. And via the grapevine, I heard that he saw his mummy, and then he died. And I still feel sad about that some way. That was kind of unnecessary.
Nurses played a vital role in the medical operations, which had to be undertaken on a vast scale during the Great War. More than 3 million such operations were performed on British servicemen in the hospitals in Belgium, France, and at home. Surgery often took place in rooms which had been hastily converted into operating theatres.
We had no proper theatre there, and all those shelves and the walls behind and everything had to be carbolized. In those days we used carbolic acid. No wonder your hands are awful. And nurses used to do this. The sister and myself used to do it very, very often. If you had an emergency operation, this had to be made ready first. And then the patient would be brought in on a stretcher by the orderlies, put on the table, the stretcher taken away.
One of the most common operations was the removal of shrapnel and bullets from deep inside the soldiers' bodies. But when limbs were shattered beyond repair, they had to be amputated.
When the Tommy had to go to the theatre to be operated on, I would help to cover him with sterile towels, just exposing the leg that was going to be amputated. I can't remember that I was ever what you call deeply affected by the sight of the tissues being divided and the bone either being cut through or disjointed and the limb carried away. It may sound heartless, but it's all part of the training. I was warned by somebody who knew that if, when you go first time in the theatre, so many nurses who have to attend their first operation will faint when the first incision is made. But if you make a point of looking over there when they're doing the incision there, and then turn your head afterwards, if you don't see the first incision made, you're all right. But if you see the blood oozing out, you're done for.
After these amputations, the nurses faced the immense challenge of supporting each soldier through the trauma of coming to terms with his disability. In the absence of any comprehensive policy to assist the war wounded, their mental rehabilitation was largely left to the initiative of individual nurses. After the Tommy got back to the ward, if he was in your care,
my care, then you would do your best, first of all, to make him comfortable, to make him realise what had happened. Some were prepared to accept it without apparently bemoaning. They were so glad to get rid of this limb that had been painful and difficult and prevented him getting about. And you would then get the person who would bemoan the fact that he was going to be minus a leg. Then you tried to put the best side, and the fact that he now wouldn't get that pain once it had settled down, and that it would shortly heal with a good stump that would fit into the artificial limb comfortably. And they gradually would come round and be themselves again.
I put my arms around their neck and patted them until, it won't be so bad presently. You'll hear in the morning or something like that. Anything to quieten them. Anything to quieten them. I don't like to see a man cry.
All nurses were expected to contain their emotions whilst on duty in the military wards. But the mass of individual tragedies they had to deal with every day often made self-control very difficult. Violet Cullen served as a VAD at Northampton Hospital.
You're a nurse, you've got to be a little bit harder, not hard, but stern with yourself. You didn't always cry over them because they wouldn't like that. They'd laugh and say, that's me that's got to cry, not you. It did upset us sometimes on our own, You don't do that in front of them. You just do that on your own. Have a little weep on your own.
The soldiers not only suffered from the most horrendous physical injuries, many were also mentally scarred by the constant stress and terror of serving in the front line. They suffered from what came to be called shell shock. In the most extreme cases, this took the form of paralysis, bodily contortions and panic attacks. The nurses who cared for these men were amongst the first to glimpse their inner torment. Mary Jolly worked as a general nurse on a military ward in Edinburgh containing shell-shocked soldiers.
The tremors that you would have would come on quite quickly. There'd be nothing to cause them, for instance, nothing that you could link up the tremor with. And they would just start trembling and not only lose control of the speech, but slavering, not being able to control the saliva. And it was a very terrible thing to see. They were afraid to sleep because they were shell-shocked, and they had these nightmares which were very terrible. One soldier who was so afraid of going to sleep because of the nightmares that he had. And of course it wasn't my business to go into that. That was the medical officer's business. But I couldn't help trying to ease the situation. And I said, what did you see? And he said, well, I saw wounded men on the ground. And our tanks coming along and just mowing through the wounded men. He said it was very terrible.
But that was one of the worst ones. That was part of my job, sitting talking to them. Trying to make them forget, but they couldn't forget.
In 1915, over 20,000 British soldiers were admitted to hospital with shell shock. There was widespread official alarm that mental disturbance was undermining the war effort and being used as a cover for malingering. In some hospitals, matrons instructed their staff to take a hard line with shell-shocked patients, but the nurses involved in the everyday care of these men were more sympathetic.
We had a shell-shock soldier who couldn't tie his tie. So I was tying up his tie when matron came along and said, "We don't have your nurses to tie the ties up for soldiers." And I said, well, matron, his hand he can't use, so he asked me to tie his tie. And I've tied it, and I'll tie it again, whether you like it or not. I'm here to look after them as a nurse. The matron said no more. And she knew I meant what I said, and that was true. So I tied the tie.
It was a much freer atmosphere, and they were so grateful for anything that was done for them.
Oh yes, we had to have a chat to them sometime to brighten them up. And then, you know, if they've had letters from home, they want you to read it to them, perhaps if they can't read it. And then they have a laugh over it, you see. One man said, "Give me a nurse Grout to look after me. I don't want anyone else." I was Nurse Grout.
Many of the men had been starved of female company for so long, the sharing of simple pleasures with the nurses had a profound therapeutic effect.
When we came off duty at about 8:30, we had our supper, and then we used to go into the nurses' sitting room, and we were a friendly crowd. Well, you had to be when you live with people. And there was one there who played the piano. We had a piano in there, and she used to play the piano very well indeed, and the men enjoyed it. Then one night, I think I started singing, and so often after that, as we came off duty, some of them would say, "Oh, sister, do sing to us tonight again." And so that was that. It was friendly and kindly and nice. You tried to have this atmosphere, if you possibly could.
I had a very good singing voice. And in the afternoon, when they all relaxed in their beds, one of the soldiers there were many who could play the piano, got up, and I would sing all the popular songs. Mind you, don't you mix me up to the violin. I was right at the bottom of the list, but I could sing. And my voice, at this age, as you can tell, was pretty loud. All these other soldiers round said, "Now, nurse, when that little Nurse Arnold comes in to empty your ashtray, you're to throw your arms round her neck and kiss her." Well, I'd not been used to this, so I gaily went round emptying people's ashtrays, got to this bed and was emptying his ashtray when he flung his arms round me and hung on. And I hung on. And the sister rushed up and said, Nurse Arnold, give in, let him, give in, he'll die. But I didn't give in.
Jolly good luck to the girls who love the soldiers. Girls, have you been there? You know we military men always do our duty everywhere. Jolly good luck.
We young nurses, when we were on night duty, used to sneak off to the men's ward, to the soldiers' ward. And we used to have great times down there with them. And we were loved with anything to get down to the soldiers. And they were very nice to us. They loved us coming down. And we had to be careful. We were out of the hearing of the night sisters and night nurses, as we should have been for it. We'd been found down with the soldiers. I think it cheered them a lot, especially when it was the young nurses that came down. And we used to go down. They used to look forward to seeing us come down. Because they were chaps there. They hadn't got their own people. They hadn't got their mothers and their wives. And so they used to say, give us a kiss, lassie. And we used to. And we didn't think it was wrong at all.
The nurses, both VADs and professionally trained, made an immeasurable contribution to the recovery of a generation of young men blighted by the physical and mental carnage of the Great War. The care, skill and courage shown by these women, many of whom were only in their teens and 20s, provided new hope for soldiers in a world of despair.
I think a nurse develops a certain amount of what I call motherliness, the fact that she may only be in her early 20s, but because you've been caring for people so closely, you develop that feeling that you are responsible for their happiness.
I think we felt we were growing up. It was our responsibility to see that their medicines were given regularly, their dressings were done as perfectly as possible, and their peace of mind was as stable as possible. We had to feel responsible. I mean, you're not much good if you don't.
You did natural things, what you do at home with your own people. You're only natural, you know, and human. You can't go back with a straight back if they don't belong to you. No, they all belong to you. If you're a nurse.
It was nursing, pure and simple nursing, seeing somebody improving over what you were doing. And that was creative, and it was exciting. It was history in the making, wasn't it? And we were part of it. Small, insignificant, but true.
God in His mercy has sent her here in the world below. We call her Rose of Heaven. We've learned to love her so. There's a rose that grows in no man's land, and it's wonderful to me. Though it's spread with tears, it will live for years in my garden of memory. It's the one red rose the soldier knows. It's the work of the master's